books guarantees a top bestseller. The book Roots, in the first 6 months of its existence, now has sold 1,600,000 copies. I can tell you now that it is being translated now into 22 languages to be read literally around the world. The film which was shown here will be shown wherever there is television.
When Roots came out, it captivated the whole country immeasurably, not only African Americans, but all of the country. It's such a compelling story. And after it came out, there definitely was an increase in so many individuals wanting to find their own connections to their past.
Alex Haley spoke to the Tennessee State Legislature in April 1977, a time when his book Roots, a novel about his enslaved ancestors, was a cultural phenomenon. And despite controversy about the book, Nashville genealogist Taneya Koonce says she was inspired to research not only her family, but also real-life characters from Roots.
The sale of these so-called fancy girls was associated with bigger slave markets such as New Orleans or Charleston. But in this particular case, they were being sold wide open in Nashville. Fancy girl is a euphemism for a girl that was sold for sex.
Author Bill Carey usually writes history books geared for school children, but his latest project took him deep into a cruel chapter of Tennessee history. Buried in old newspaper advertisements, he found that slavery was not only for plantations, it was also a part of everyday commerce and government, so much so that the city of Nashville owned slaves. You'll hear these stories and a lot more on this episode of Nashville Retrospect. Welcome to the Nashville Retrospect podcast. I'm your host, Allen Forkum. I'm also the editor and publisher of the Nashville Retrospect, a monthly newspaper full of old news stories from and new essays about Nashville's past. In 1824, the Calf Killer River caught on fire, shooting flames over 10 feet high. In 1979, 4 Jolton High School boys reported seeing Bigfoot. In 1949, the city offered $150 to anyone who could explain why there was an Indian on the city seal, which is still there today and still unexplained. Patty Page, Pat Boone, Snowbird, all of this and a lot more are in the February 2019 issue of the Nashville Retrospect. In addition, like this month's podcast, you'll also find a special emphasis relating to Black History Month. Our History Today events column features a list of upcoming programs, such as those at the Hermitage, Fort Negley, the Public Library, and Tennessee State University, which is hosting the annual Nashville Conference on African American History and Culture. Also in the February issue, you can see a 1919 recruitment letter for a new Ku Klux Klan, which was headquartered right here in Nashville. You can see a 1969 photo of H.T. Lockard, the first African American to hold a cabinet-level position in Tennessee state government. And you can read the personal account of former Nashville slave Cecilia Chappell, who, at 102 years old, still remembered receiving the bullwhip scars on her back. To see article excerpts and photographs from some of these and other stories, visit our Facebook page. You can pick up the latest issue of the Retrospect for only $1 at local grocery stores and markets. And at NashvilleRetrospect.com, you can order subscriptions for yourself or as gifts for others, and you can purchase back issues. A special program note: we need your help to keep this podcast going. One way is to become a patron by making monthly donations, which is really easy to do. Just look for the orange Patreon button on the podcast webpage. We're also looking for major sponsors, such as businesses that want to reach thoughtful listeners like you. Tell them about us, or if you handle the marketing, contact us about advertising. And finally, if you listen to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, be sure to give us a star rating and a review. All of these things help us to keep bringing you these fascinating and enlightening stories from Nashville's past. Early in my research of old newspapers, I began finding advertisements relating to slavery. An 1810 ad for a runaway slave named Richard described him as an impudent and witty cake baker with a freckled face and a scar on his forehead. The ad also warned that he could write well enough to forge a pass. An 1835 ad said that a runaway named Willis would likely be heading for his wife, a slave who had been hired out to someone in another town. These ads, with poignant personal details about individuals and their broken families, gave me a glimpse into the cruelty of human bondage in Tennessee. But what I failed to see in the advertisements was just how pervasive the institution of slavery was. I didn't see that until I read the book Runaways, Coffles and Fancy Girls by Bill Carey.
First of all, newspapers. All newspapers in Tennessee were dependent on slave-related advertising. They all accepted slave-related advertising with two small exceptions. If they had rejected slave-related advertising, they would not have been profitable. They were all dependent on the institution. Even the ones in East Tennessee where people say, oh, we didn't have that many slaves. You had slave-related advertising in your newspapers. Even Parson Brownlow's newspaper ran slave-related advertising, a 4-page issue with maybe 6 or 7 slave-related ads. It was a big part of what they did. Second of all, the court system. The Chancery Court clerk and masters were all slave traders. The judges were all slave traders. A regular part of what you had to do in Tennessee was when somebody would die or when there was a court case or something, you would have to sell and liquidate slaves. And so every Chancery Court clerk in the state and every judge, therefore, was by definition a slave trader. Every bank in Tennessee was up to its necks in slavery, because people would borrow money to buy slaves, and people would also use slaves as collateral to borrow more money. And so the largest asset in the Southeast, or even the United States, I think, was slavery, were slaves. And so banks were completely, so if you were a banker, you were in on the slave business. Every bank in Tennessee went bankrupt in 1864 because all the slaves on their balance sheets were declared free. There are books on the history of banking in Tennessee that never mention this. A lot of manufacturing companies hired slaves, and not just like 2 or 3, but they might hire 40 or 50. The railroads would hire slaves. It's kind of across society, and after you look at it for a while, I'm not trying to say that there weren't people who were against slavery, but if you were against slavery, you had to pay the price. If you and I ran a cotton mill in 1840 and decided we're not going to hire slaves, well, our cost of labor is going to be higher than the one across the street. And so that was very much a part. Also, taxpayers all benefited from slavery because many governments leased slaves to avoid having to hire people. And in the case of Nashville, the government owned slaves. The city of Nashville purchased 26 slaves in 1830. And I still can't get the city of Nashville, even to this very moment, to find out what happened to them. So there's still denial going on.
Bill Carey is also the author of Fortunes, Fiddles, and Fried Chicken, a history of Nashville businesses. And he's the founder of Tennessee History for Kids, which produces study booklets for schools. But it was his work for another history project that led him to research slavery.
I write a column for a magazine called Tennessee Magazine, a history column. And it comes out monthly, and I've been writing this column for about 14 years. And the problem with writing a column for 14 years is one runs out of material. And I just need new columns. And so I decided what I would do is go down to the state library and look through old microfilm newspapers until I found a column. And I decided my first idea was to do a column on the first couple of issues of the Knoxville Gazette ever printed in the state of Tennessee. This is right up your alley. The only other person who would think of this idea is you, by the way. And it was meant to be kind of a fun thing. And I started looking at the newspaper, and the first thing that jumped out at me are the slavery-related ads, because you don't think about slaves in Knoxville in 1791. You just don't. It's not part of what we teach. And as I started looking at those ads, I then jumped a year ahead and found some other slave-related ads. And then next thing you know, I started looking through all of the Knoxville Gazettes. And I found about 30 different slavery-related ads over the 8 years that they have. And then I just kept the search going. And I realized as I was going through it that no one had ever done this before. No one had ever gone through and very carefully put in an Excel file all the slave-related ads, especially the runaway slave ads. And when you do this, there are questions that come to mind because it's been so long since these ran that we don't understand them anymore. We don't understand the language. We don't understand the implications. And once you look at this, a couple of things come out about slavery that are not debatable. And yet there's things people don't believe or understand or have ever been taught today.
Well, another thing that came across to me from reading the book, and it's one thing to say, yeah, slavery is about treating people as property.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I read your book that I really got a sense of how true that was. It's treated like an asset, or and in any way that an asset might be treated today, a piece of property, that's how human beings were treated, certain human beings at that time. Can you give us some examples of all of the different ways in which that form of property?
Well, first of all, there's a word in the title. I may not have given this book a great title. There's a couple of phrases in the title that people don't understand. Coffle is the name of a chain gang of slaves that's being moved from one place to the other. That word is still used in the world of agriculture. A herd of a chained together group of animals is called a coffle. So it's still out there, but it's just not used for humans. But think of it this way. Let's say that you live in Tennessee and you own James K. Polk was a big slave owner. People don't know much about James K. Polk, but he was very much an investor. Every year he would buy 2 or 3 slaves. Even when he was president, he would buy slaves. And you think about how he was building his wealth. Let's say that he owned a female slave who had a child. Well, that's a nice event. That boosts his revenue base a little bit. The moment a female slave had a child, that meant that not only did you have more assets, it meant you could borrow more money, because now you have more to use as collateral. And it is because of that. For example, I found some ads, and there aren't very many of these, that talk about how much slaves were sold for. You have a lot of ads about upcoming slave sales, but very few that will tell you how much they were sold for. I found one very interesting one that did, and it went into all the detail about how much each particular slave was sold for. And a woman who was unfit, which I assume means can't have children, would sell for a small fraction of what a woman who could have children or who had born children already. Older men. And there was one ad where I found an old man who was, I shouldn't say old because I'm almost this age myself, but a man who was 60 years old would sell for $100. A child who's 12 might sell for $2,000. Okay, so it's all about how much labor is theoretically ahead of you, how much you're late. And I hate to say it, but the more you learn about it, you keep shaking your head. Finally I realized that you almost have to put your mind into thinking how a farmer would think today. That's the best way to understand sort of the laws and the ads, is to sort of think about how a farmer views his crop, views his livestock today. I hate to say it.
Like a horse or...
Yes.
Or...
Yes. For example, we dug up the Tennessee law related to slavery. There was no law whatsoever that restricted or forbid what a person could do to his slave. But there was a law that says that a person cannot beat the slave of another person. I thought that was interesting, that they went to the trouble to write that law. Well, why is that? Well, for the same reason that I can take a baseball bat and dent my own car, but I can't dent yours. One of the things I learned in doing this book is that a person might own 40 slaves and lease out 38 of them as an investment thing, where you might lease 10 of them to the railroad, 10 of them to the local factory, and you make the money that the slaves make. It was under this format that a lot of institutions did own enslaved people. Okay, the most interesting types of institutions is churches. There were churches in Virginia that owned slaves, and they didn't. That's not because they had a lot of yard work that needed to be done. That's because they would buy them as investment. The truth of the matter is, the more you learn about slavery, the more you learn that it's not just about agriculture. There's some people who think that slavery would have eventually been gotten rid of when we became less of an agrarian economy. I'm not so sure about that, because slavery appeared to be adjusting just fine to the advent of the railroads and to the mechanization of the South that was happening before the Civil War. Let me give you another example that struck me. When the Memphis and Charleston Railroad was opened, that was a huge boost to the slave industry, because all the slaves that were being exported from South Carolina to Texas, and places like Texas and Louisiana, and there was a big market moving slaves from one part of the country to the other. It was a boon to that industry because they no longer had to walk them or take them by boat. And one of the more ubiquitous advertisers in the Charleston newspapers after that railroad opened was someone named Nathan Bedford Forrest, a slave trader in Memphis. You might wonder why. What was he doing in Charleston? He was buying slaves and then taking them on the railroad to Memphis. So that's an example of what I mean. It's like, whoa, that kind of helped the slave trade, not hurt it. The United States of America banned the international slave trade around 1808. That meant slaves were no longer allowed to be brought from Africa to this country, even though people kind of know that there were violations of that law. I didn't realize how open the violations were until I saw an article about slaves straight from Africa being sold in Memphis by Nathan Bedford Forrest. And so there weren't just violations of the law, they were in the newspapers, and it wasn't even considered to be worrisome, not enough to be writing about it. And so what this means, this ad was ran in 1859, what this means is there was a shipload of slaves kidnapped in Africa, brought to, I guess, Charleston. Some of them put on the train, brought to Memphis, and sold in the streets of Memphis.
Another Tennessee slave trader was Isaac Franklin, who lived near Nashville in Sumner County. His company, Franklin and Armfield, became one of the largest in the South. His fortune was inherited by his wife, Adelicia Ackland, of later Belmont Mansion fame.
Franklin and Armfield at one time had 5 ships. That's how busy they were, which would carry about 100 slaves per ship. One of the reasons we know so much about Franklin and Armfield is these ships would leave Virginia and go all the way around the Florida Panhandle to New Orleans. Well, international law, I guess, states that you have to list the names of every living human on a ship that's out on the open sea. And so we still have those records. So in the case of Franklin and Armfield, we have extremely good records, at least about the number of people that they moved. And it's more than 10,000. And so there's a huge migration just from this one company that happens to have been owned by a man who happens to be from actually Sumner County, Tennessee.
Being that Isaac Franklin lived in the Nashville area, I asked Carey if he found advertisements in local newspapers that mentioned Franklin and his slave trading.
The Isaac Franklin story has been extremely well documented in the last couple of years. There was a Smithsonian cover story about it. And then the Nashville Scene did a cover story. So it's actually, as it turns out, I didn't discover Isaac Franklin in the newspapers. I discovered him in these other sources because Isaac Franklin's name almost never comes up in the Tennessee newspapers because Isaac Franklin bought slaves in Virginia and Maryland. Well, he even though he lived here, he did business elsewhere and sold them in New Orleans and in Mississippi. So once I discovered he was out there, I started doing searches for his name, and I did run across his name about 5 times, but not nearly as much as you would think. One time because 3 of his slaves that he owned had run away from Sumner County, and a couple of times you would find in a runaway ad it would say, a lot of times there's all sorts of information in a runaway ad, and it would say, this particular slave I purchased from Mr. Isaac Franklin or something. You'll run across that 2 or 3 times. But I did not, from the Tennessee newspapers, you don't realize who he is and what he does.
The commerce in African people, who ranged from pregnant women and toddlers all the way to the elderly, often took place in slave marts, one of which was located in downtown Nashville.
There were these slave marts in places like Memphis and Nashville and Alexandria, Virginia, and Charleston, where you would actually go in and you would be able to kind of look over. There might be 100, 105, there might be 28, there might be 300, depending on the time of year and the market, slaves that were basically being sold. And you would be able to go in and kind of look around, and there might be slaves that have been there for 2 days or 2 months. And the one in Nashville, the big one in Nashville, was at the corner of 5th and Charlotte. This one location in downtown Nashville, every 3 years or so, would change ownership and change the name. But apparently it was quite the operation, and it had what effectively amounts to an outdoor jail. And it is described in its own advertising in glowing terms, claiming that the slaves were treated very well there and that the general public is welcome to come in at any time and see our... And by the way, one reads different accounts of what life was like for the enslaved in these places. Obviously, the morale would have been horrible, especially for the people who were being removed away from their families. But the truth is, oftentimes the enslaved were given new suits of clothing and were fed well in these places, because if you were selling, you didn't want them to look like they were concentration camp victims. And so a lot of times they might, the first-person accounts that you read, and there are many first-person accounts of these from slave narratives in the 1920s and 1930s. In general, they talk about how degrading it was and humiliating it was, but at the same time, they might have been fed fairly well there, to the degree that really matters at that point. So I do wish we had more first-person accounts of these, but we don't. And I wish anything we had a photograph, but of course we don't.
One of the many atrocious aspects of slavery was the breaking up of families, the tearing away of children from their parents and siblings, the separation of couples.
Tennessee did not have any law that prohibited the sale of any slave of any age, whether by themselves or away from their family. Other states did, but not Tennessee. It's interesting. People talk about Tennessee being a more friendly state. Well, not legally we weren't. So we know that there was no law that required a 2-year-old to be sold with his or her mother until the very eve of the Civil War. In 1860, a law was created. And you start noticing a slight difference when the ads, they'll start saying that this woman's being sold with her 2 children. But so we know, and we also know from first-person accounts that often a 4-year-old would be sold away from a 6-year-old. I didn't just look at Runaways at advertisements. There were places where I had questions, and there were about 7 or 8 books that I bought and read. Almost all of them are now out of print. What I would find when I looked at these books on slavery is I might find in the footnotes a reference to something else, and I would dig up that something else. One of the things I dug up was the memoirs of a man who had been to a slave auction in Rutherford County in a place called Murfreesboro, and he remembers the exact day. It was like January 1st, 1851, and there's about a 3-page description of the slave auction. And according to his account, at that slave auction, he happened to be standing very close to another man who owned a slave, and the slave was standing next to that man, and while they were watching his wife be auctioned off, the slave who was standing near him was begging his holder to buy his wife who was being auctioned off. And there were 2 bidders, and this man was one of them, and the other was a professional slave trader. We don't know who that was. And they went back and forth, and eventually the professional slave trader bid enough and took the woman that was being sold. And according to his account, there were 200 people at this slave auction, and only 2 people were bidding. Okay, so that means 198 or so were there just to watch. So I guess this was a regular thing, and this was at the Murfreesboro courthouse.
The destructions of families may not have been the cruelest aspect of slavery in Nashville. Advertisements here include what was known as Fancy Girls.
Yeah, Fancy Girls is something I didn't know what it was. It's mentioned in some advertisements by a slave trader in Nashville named Reese W. Porter, who was one of the many slave traders who came and went from the location of about 5th and Charlotte, which is now 5th and Martin Luther King because they renamed the road. And it was then called 5th and Cedar, to add to the confusion. He would sometimes in his ads, and they're blown up in the book, talk about fancy girls, and it come to find out that a fancy girl is a euphemism for a girl that was sold for sex. And she might be, as it'll say, a 13-year-old A number 1 fancy girl. And it will say real pretty or something. Well, so this girl's being sold for this particular purpose. And that's amazing. And remember, these are ads that run in the regular newspaper. And it's amazing to think now that newspapers in recent years have had debates about whether they should run escort ads. Well, they didn't have that debate back in 1850. And by the way, this is the Old South we're talking about. And this was across the street from the Catholic Church, which is still there. So this aspect of slavery kind of goes against the picture of it that we see in Gone with the Wind, And so I don't understand how a slaveholder could get away with buying a fancy girl and bring her home, but apparently it happened.
Stop the Runaways was a typical headline in advertisements for escaped slaves. Because the slaveholder included descriptions of the escapees, these ads provided some of the most revealing information about enslaved individuals.
Sometimes the ad will talk about what the person was wearing and and then sometimes it'll talk about something completely different. So there's all sorts of information in these. It might describe a scar. It might not describe a scar. It might describe what the person did as an enslaved person. For example, Montgomery Bell had bought 7 ads over the course of his life, at least 7 that I found, and it would often describe their occupation in his iron foundries. And in one case, their occupation was engineer. Well, yeah, okay, that's pretty well trained slave there. No wonder he ran away. But then sometimes it would be a carpenter, and you'd run into a lot of bricklayers, brick masons, painters, plasterers. So there's all this information. Then a lot of times it might talk about just for expressions that make you wonder. There was one of the Andrew Jackson ads where there's a specific trait that he described that the particular slave had. It makes you realize he knew this guy pretty well. He had a nervous tic or something. And you're like, wow, I was able to put all these in an appendix, and the appendix is like 53 pages long. But there's the first 5 columns are pretty much standard issue information, name of the slave holder, the name of the enslaved, and all this. And then it'll have special notes. For example, here's one from 1845. This person whose name was Andy. He is a barber who was some years ago employed by Reuben Graham in Nashville, Shelbyville, and Murfreesboro. Quote, quick of speech and when excited lisps a little. So in some ways, the specific descriptions of these people are we now know little traits about these people that we didn't know about their slaveholder. I mean, we don't know anything about J.H. Greer, the slaveholder, but we apparently know something about Andy.
And what, when it comes to Runaway, I've noticed in these ads they'll offer a reward. It seemed like Jackson's ad even suggested beating them.
Yeah, that was the only that ad is the only time anyone's ever found anything quite like that, where he apparently was pretty mad, and he said that I'll pay you more if you beat the guy before you give him back to me, which is pretty strange. One other thing that's in these ads a lot, and I have a whole chapter about this, the ads, and this was the first thing that caught my eye about these ads. You would think that almost everyone who'd run away, that there would be an assumption that they're heading straight north, but that's not true. Here's one, and I'm just looking at it, where it'll talk about they have family in Columbia, Tennessee, or they have family in Shelbyville, they have family in Virginia, which is where they're going back to. It's almost an admission in the runaway slave ads that these people are miserable because I took them away from their mothers or their brothers or their children. And there's not 20 of these. There's like more than 100 of these where it even says it. It predicts what direction they'll head it. They're headed in. In some cases, it might list 4 family members in 4 different places.
In addition to all of this information, Carey also discovered a few items in newspapers that documented the use of slave labor by both state and federal governments.
A couple other things that I found in the book that are of interest to history buffs. I found an ad, I don't think it has ever been found before, that proved that there was a slave killed during the construction of the Tennessee State Capitol. That's new because, the reason I say that's a new discovery is the state of Tennessee has officially sanctioned and commissioned many books on the history of the Capitol and never mentioned that. Because it wasn't in the official records, because apparently it wasn't important enough to be in the official records. Also, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is the U.S. Army, that they hired slaves when they built roads in West Tennessee. I'm not sure people know that the United States Army, which this isn't the Southern Army, the United States Army would hire slaves in the 1830s. That was news to me. So there were little things I came across that I just... Obviously, the topic kind of overwhelmed me, and I realized, going back to my original purpose, this became more than a column, and I knew I had to do a book because there was just so much new in here, for me at least.
For me personally, Carey's book helped me better understand a Civil War incident that I came across in my research. When federal troops arrived in Nashville in February 1862, after many residents had fled in the Great Panic, the mayor of Nashville went across the river to meet the conquering army. One of the first questions he asked them was what would be done with the slaves. He was assured by the federal commander that the property of Nashville citizens, whatever the description, would be protected. A witness noticed that this assurance had a, quote, perceptible influence in quieting the fears of some who had anticipated trouble on that point. In contrast to what I think can be learned from Runaways, Coffles, and Fancy Girls, Carey said the book has not been embraced by everyone.
This book has got a lot of critics. It has not sold that well. And I've had a lot of people who will tell me, your book is way off because most people were against slavery, and you've got it all wrong. I've had people tell me slavery wasn't that cruel of an institution. I mean, we're living difficult times. A man from Alabama who believes blacks were better off under slavery nearly got elected to the U.S. Senate. So there's a lot of people who don't like this book.
Part of the problem may be in how slavery has been taught in Tennessee schools, and perhaps there's a lesson here for many of us.
My concern is that historically in Tennessee, we don't talk about slavery until we talk about the Civil War. Like, we never talk about slavery in the 1790s and talk about the War of 1812. No one ever mentions slavery. And I'm not saying that it doesn't have to be the main thing, but for example, in the War of 1812, a lot of the armory and the cannonballs and everything were made by Montgomery Bell's operation. Well, that was all slaves. And so, it does need to be pointed out, and it is something you need to know about.
Our thanks to Bill Carey for the interview. You can find links to his books and to Tennessee History for Kids on the podcast webpage.
Governor Blanton, honored legislature and honored citizens and fellow Tennesseans, I obviously am extremely moved at this happening. I have been saying all morning, walking along, I wish Grandma was here. And then I think she is here. I know she is, with that feather that used to sit up at a 45-degree angle from her head on Sunday mornings. And I guess the first thing I should tell you is...
It was Alex Haley's grandmother in Henning, Tennessee, who had told him stories of his African ancestors, stories that eventually led him to write Roots, the saga of an American family. The book's hero, Kunta Kinte, would become a household name.
Tonight, we present a landmark in television entertainment. Roots, the true story Alex Haley uncovered in his 12-year search across the 7 generations of his ancestry. After 2 years of production, we present this incredible saga in an epic motion picture. Roots, the current #1 best-selling novel, is the television event of the year. From primitive Africa to the Old South. So, Roots sweeps across the...
I got so taken about the response, some of the reasons for the response to Roots. One of them was, it just hadn't occurred to me until after the book was written, and what that book does, really, is it deals with an old, familiar story, that of slavery. But what it really does is, for the first time, it tells it from the point of view of the slave. That's really sort of what Roots does, and that was it. And in telling the history of a people, it touched people all over this country and this world.
By the time Haley appeared before the state legislature in April 1977, he was an international celebrity. The book had sold over 1.6 million copies. The final episode of the 8-part TV miniseries had beaten Gone with the Wind for audience size, which ABC said averaged 80 million viewers. And the state of Tennessee had just announced a 3-day, 6-city homecoming tribute to Alex Haley. Haley's speech was wide-ranging, from stories of his work in Africa to commentary on race relations in America. He repeatedly praised the South and his Southern upbringing, which he contended was often unjustly maligned in the North.
One of the nicest things, one of the best things that ever happened to me was growing up in a small town in the South, where there was instilled in me the kind of virtues and the kind of values that every one of us who had that experience, this having nothing to do with race, had instilled in us. I would rather have done that than grown up in the greatest metropolis in the world. Nothing, no citadel, no nothing ever could have instilled into me what, say, was in the little church New Hope CME in Henning, Tennessee, or in the little school we went to, Palmer Turner Elementary and so forth, and the teachers and the people and the kind of community of which I'm sure all of you who came from little towns will share, where it wasn't just your parents who kept you in line, it was everybody in town kept you in line until there was no problem about that, Yeah, that's right.
On the issue of racism, Haley said the South was better prepared to make progress than the North, despite the South's history of slavery and racial segregation.
You see, we have a great advantage here. In the South, even during slavery, and increasingly since slavery, the South has the great advantage of the races that the people knew each other, lived physically proximate to each other. In the little towns, even when there was the time of the strictest segregation, which we now all deplore in retrospect, even then, the people in those towns, white and black, knew each other as individuals, could call each other's names, knew a little bit of something about each other's families. That is not true in other sections of the country where people are abstract, where people may live literally years, 6 doors down this one door, and not know who lives next door to them. And that is not the way of the South. We have that great advantage going.
But the main reason Haley was in the state capitol was because of the success of Roots, and he gave credit to his family by telling the story of how his father received a college education with the financial assistance of a stranger. Stay tuned after the end of this podcast to hear that story in his own words, a story which was also dramatized in the follow-up TV series, Roots, The Next Generations.
And I'm happy I can share that is we are going to be making another 12 hours of Roots. It'll pick it up right where it left it off in Tennessee, and most of this 12 hours will be portraying Tennessee and things which happened with that family as it went forward across the turn of the century and into the early 1900s up to Tennessee. And I was saying as we were coming up here that
One day we were watching The Next Generation, and in The Next Generation there's a family that's portrayed, a white man who in the series is named Jim Warner, falls in love with a black school teacher, and they get married and have children, and the father of the man outcasts him because his son has basically betrayed his race, right, by falling in love and marrying a black woman.
Taneya Koonce works in information science in Nashville, a discipline she also uses for genealogical research. Her husband is a big fan of the Next Generation series, and they rewatch the show every year.
So my husband was curious if I could find the original family. And at first I said, I'm not sure how I'm going to locate them. This is a story. He said, well, do what you do. And he gave me a suggestion for how to start. And I took hold of that suggestion and was able to find the real family that the story was based on, that couple and their family was portraying. So I wrote a blog post about my process to find them. Then I got a comment later from a descendant of that family. She said, yes, this is my family. And she sent me a picture of the real family. So I've done a blog post about that too. So finding the real family that is portrayed later on in Roots, that was just amazing.
Though Koonce was too young to catch the original airing of Roots on television, it and the book were still an early influence.
I first read Roots when I was 15, and one summer watched the whole miniseries in one day. So I was binge watching Roots before there was even a concept of binge watching. But I was just really taken by it. And like I said, at that time, I wasn't necessarily interested in my own family history, but the story captivated me.
Roots sparked a surge of interest in genealogy. The National Archives reported a tenfold increase in inquiries by African Americans after only 3 episodes of the TV show had aired. And though Koonce would eventually be inspired by Roots, her interest in her ancestors started in the same way as Alex Haley's.
The first time I had a real interest in it, I was in college. And at that time, I sat down with both of my grandmothers and asked them to tell me about their family. And I'm a copious note taker. I took notes. And that was in college. And then I put the notes away after they shared what they had to share. But after I had my daughter in 2004, one day I was cleaning house and was putting things away, and I came across my notes. And I had pushed them in a drawer. They were, out of sight, out of mind. And when I found the notes again, they were starting to get worn and tear. And by this point, both of my grandmothers had Alzheimer's. I realized, wait a minute, I need to do something with this information because I can't go back and ask them questions. So can I at least try to verify what they told me? And that was it. I started looking for records to verify what they had shared with me and became hooked. And so ever since then, I've been researching my own family history, documenting what I found, trying to share those stories with my family in as many different ways as I can. And it's just been extremely rewarding.
Genealogical research can be challenging for anyone. Where do you start? What institutions have which records? But for African Americans, it poses special challenges.
One of the aspects that makes it different is the fact that prior to emancipation, documentation of those that have been enslaved becomes a bit more challenging to locate and find. It's there in many cases, but you have to begin to understand the approaches that you need to take in order to find it. Because prior to emancipation, many individuals who had been enslaved or were enslaved were not documented by name in some of the records that those who start searching their genealogies begin with, such as the census. Let's take the census, for example. So the United States Census is done every 10 years. It's constitutionally mandated that the country count its population. And it's been done every 10 years since 1790. Well, prior to the 1870 census, if you were an African American person, you most likely were not enumerated by name unless you were free. If you were enslaved, you were enumerated as a tick mark as a slave person in a white person's household. So when you don't have the names available to you, it becomes difficult to track down those family clusters. 1870 was the first year that African Americans who had been enslaved were systematically documented by name in the census, and every 10 years since then. So a lot of people, when they get back to 1870, hit what's known as a brick wall, because you're not able to use some of the more traditional approaches all the time to locate your family. You begin to have to circumvent that process by researching perhaps the family that you suspect owned your family, because slaves are property. So then you need to see if you can identify that slaveholding family and start looking at their property records, taxes, deeds, wills. Are they leaving in their will an enslaved person to a family member? So it's a different set of information looking skills that you need to embrace in order to find your enslaved ancestors. So it makes it challenging. And also at the same time, it really just gives you perspective, because you realize when you have successes that you're able to find your family, it can be so rewarding because you're finding them amidst these challenges. And I almost think of it similar to, all the adversity that they went through to live and exist. Us tracing their histories and finding them is a testament to what they went through.
Old newspapers and oral histories are also sources of information about ancestors. For Koonce, they revealed some of the hard choices slavery imposed upon black families.
One of my best finds in newspapers from my own personal family history was an 1899 obituary or death notice of my third great-grandfather. He died in 1899, and it was a very small town in North Carolina. So in the late 1800s, you don't have too many black individuals explicitly mentioned in the newspapers unless they were doing something wrong, right? Or marriage notices were often posted, but it's a rare find. And so there was a death notice for him. In fact, this is the father of the runaway slave. So it said that he died. He was 90 years old, and they called him a good old before the war darky, which to me gave me an impression that he obeyed the social conventions of a black person at that time, because here's the white citizenship having this complimentary death notice about him. When I found out the story of his son who'd run away and the oral history that had been passed down through his family, it made perfect sense. So because this was a man, the one whose death notice was in the paper, who had responsibility for the plantation, kind of an overseer responsibility, and was trusted by his owners, and he had in fact helped his son run away. So he's got this dual relationship with what he knows is an unjust system, so he helped his son run away, but at the same time presenting to the white citizenship like he was totally in line.
In searching for slave owners who may have owned her ancestors, Koonce narrowed it down to 2 possible men in North Carolina. To her surprise, it was a trail that also led to Nashville.
When I moved to Nashville, my first visit to the Tennessee State Museum, I'd gone down the escalators because this was in the old location. So I'd gone down the escalators, and one of the first exhibit windows or exhibit spaces they had talked about families that settled when Nashville was being settled. And I read on the plaque that there were Koonces, and I thought, Oh my goodness, there were Koonces that came to Nashville. And so that really set me on a path to learn more about Koonces in Davidson County. And as I researched that particular Koonce family, learned that they were related to the potential slave holders of my own family's Koonces in eastern North Carolina. And there are Koonces all throughout Tennessee. And so that helped me just have another connection to Nashville because there were Koonces here in Davidson County.
Koonce is still trying to verify a family connection to a North Carolina slaveholder. One way she hopes to do so is with the latest tool for genealogists, DNA testing, which a number of websites offer today.
18% of my DNA can be traced back to European populations, which is about average for African Americans in the United States, given what happened during slavery. And then for the rest of my sample that is of African origin, they even try to break down what region. So they'll say Nigeria or Cameroon. Like they try to associate the origins of your DNA. And each company will have a different breakdown because it's based on their own data sets. So it's helpful to do your DNA with multiple companies because they'll each give you a little bit of a different picture. So giving your ethnic analysis is one component. Another component is showing you people who share DNA with you, because there are ways to infer relationships based on how much DNA you share with someone.
Taneya Koonce writes a blog about her research methods and discoveries. She's involved with the Nashville chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society and with the Middle Tennessee Genealogical Society. She also gives talks and workshops on how to conduct research. You can find links to all these sources and events on the podcast webpage. Being that Roots continues to inspire interest in family research, it's worth noting the controversies that surrounded the book in 1977. Alex Haley was accused of plagiarism, and he eventually admitted that some passages in Roots had been copied from another book. His research methods were also challenged. One problem was that the novel, though based on factual research, was still a novel with fictional elements. And it didn't help that the book was sold in nonfiction sections of bookstores, or that ABC billed the TV show as a true story.
After the book came out, it became evident to many that his research methods maybe were not up to par, and then he was sued by others for copyright infringement. And ultimately what happened is he acknowledged that not everything in the book was factually accurate. He did take license with how he told the story as far as making up conversations, just trying to fill in the picture around what he'd found in his research. There was also criticism about his research that he really had not found Kunta Kinte like he said he did, because the original records didn't bear out what he was saying. So there was criticism around that. And I actually did a blog post where I too pondered, well, what does that mean, right? Here's a book that definitely is such an imprint on our culture and society that tells this story of a man connecting with his roots when we have a whole swath of our population that are disenfranchised, and he's holding up a beacon saying, look, you can connect back. This is my story. This is our story. But yet knowing that factually that may not have been the case. So I wrote a blog post where I explored this just for my own self. And ultimately I come to the conclusion that yes, it may not all be factually accurate. Yes, he took poetic license. He was sued for copyright infringement, but the story is still an incredible one. And it's something that, many people can connect with in so many ways. Even if we do not find that ancestor that was brought over from the continent of Africa, we can still go through our own personal quest to try and make that connection. Because it's like I said earlier, it's a way to honor the memories of our ancestors when we are trying to figure out what their lives were like. Because genealogy is more than just collecting names. You're trying to paint the story, understand the context of the lives they lived.
Of a vibrant country and its people through the years of slavery, the Civil War,
are we gonna whoop them Yankees?
Reconstruction, and the struggle to survive.
We want you, nigger.
A film spanning more than 100 years, generation to generation, continent to continent, slavery to freedom.
Hear me, O African. The flesh of your flesh has come to freedom. We are free.
Roots, starring Ben Vereen, Edward Asner, Lorne Green, Cicely...
In his speech to the state legislature, Haley noted that while Roots was a story about a black American family, it had implications for white American families, too.
One of the biggest problems that we seem to have is we know so little about each other in ethnic group terms. And I got about 2 years ago just curious, and I began to do a little peripheral study about this body of people we tend to call white people, who embrace everybody. But then I began to realize that all these people are different ethnic groups. And in this nation of immigrants, with the single exception of the American Indian, all the rest of us in this country ancestrally came from somewhere across that ocean. And so I began to do some researching, not really researching, but just reading about the prototype histories of every major ethnic group in this nation of immigrants. And what I discovered was that every single one, it didn't matter what was their old country, that if you went back only about 300 or 400 years, and you go back to their cultures at the time, their customs at the time, the problems of those people at that time, the harassments, in some cases even persecutions of those people at that time, religious, economic, or otherwise, that came to the period of time when the word America hung like a beacon over their heads. And then that led into the immigrant generation. And then that generation into the first generation in this country to assimilate. I began to discover that it is the black story is a thrilling, stirring human drama, but that no less thrilling and stirring a human drama is that of all the ethnic groups comprising those people we tend to call white.
Alex Haley died in 1992 and is buried beside his childhood home in Henning, Tennessee, which also has a museum. A remake of the Roots TV show aired on the History Channel in 2016. Our thanks to Taneya Koonce for the interview. Thank you for listening to this episode of Nashville Retrospect. For more information about the stories you heard, including photographs and links, see the show notes on the podcast webpage, which you can find a link to at nashvilleretrospect.com. You can also email your comments and suggestions to nashretroshow@gmail.com. This show was written and produced by me, Allen Forkum. Stay tuned for the next one. And in the meantime, don't forget to pick up your copy of the Nashville Retrospect.
I guess the first thing I should tell you is why I really, truly do have this honor to be standing here in a kind of precedental way this morning or this afternoon. It is in a certain sense, I was thinking, coming here from Washington, it really is a Tennessee story that I'd just like to share with you. And again, it is the real reason that I'm having this honor, much more than, say, my having written the book Roots, or things which are derivative of that book. This particular story starts before I was born. It goes back to my father. Roots deals with my mother's side of the story out of Henning, Tennessee, in Lauderdale County. But earlier than that, my dad was born in a little town called Savannah, Tennessee. And it was a community in which his father, Alec Haley, ran a ferry boat across the river, and together with that, he was one of the many sharecroppers in that area. As I understand it, during that period, the people had fairly sizable families as a rule, white and black, and the local schools, I know for black, and I imagine for white, were about on the same area, ran from, well, first grade or kindergarten through the 8th grade. And as I was later told, the popular concept was that the children would usually finish about the 4th grade. Then they would drop out, and they would go to work on their local sharecrop farms. The popular concept of being well off, as the expression went, was the more people one had physically to work on the farms, the better off one was. And for that reason, it was generally considered that if a child went much beyond the 4th grade, it was considered that it was simply a wasted person. And it was with that concept as a backdrop that my father, going to school there in the early grades in Savannah, first heard about a place called college. He went home. He proceeded to talk about this over a period of time to his mother, who apparently became pretty intrigued with the fact that he talked so much about this college. All they knew, there was one of them somewhere. And over a period of time, the mother got kind of intrigued with it, and she took up a practice using the wiles of a wife and mother, and got hold of the stern, strict father, and finally convinced him that since they had so many children, 8, of whom my dad was the youngest, that wouldn't it be kind of locally, socially prestigious if they would waste just one of them? And I understand that within that context that my father was permitted to go on and finish the 8th grade. Well, by the time he did that, his father had gone that far, and I suppose he felt he would make a little further investment. He called my dad in and gave him a strict talking to, told him that in effect he was released from his commitment to work on the farm, and that he was going to give my dad $50 and told him never ask him for any more. And my dad said he knew his father well enough to know he never was going to ask him for any more. With the $50 and his few belongings, clothing and stuff, in a little foot locker, Dad went to a town, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was named Saltillo. And there he caught the first train he ever had seen in his life. And he rode to a city called Jackson, Tennessee. At that time, it was called Lane Institute, was in Jackson. It went then from the 9th grade through 2 years of college. Dad later would tell us it was a time when you didn't write ahead and get enrollment and all that arranged in advance. You would just turn up on a campus in September and kind of work it out. Well, he did thus manage to get enrolled. Even then, the $50 did not go very far. And it turned out that over a period of time, he was working gradually 4 odd jobs. He worked in a nursery. There was some job where he got up at 3:30 in the morning and went to make fires in the home of someone who lived in the city of Jackson, and a couple of other jobs, and he would study as best he could. He sang in the choir at Lane Institute, and Dad would say that his averages were terrible. He would average C-D, and he just couldn't help it. He would explain to us later, boys, the reason I couldn't do any better was that by the time I finished working those 4 odd jobs, I would just simply often just literally go to sleep when I got reading my books. Thus his poor averages. Thus he stumbled through high school. Then he transferred to North Carolina, Greensboro, A&T. Again, 4 odd jobs, hanging on, tail end of everything, particularly academically. C-D averages. He went through freshman college that way and through most of sophomore year that way. And then Dad said that in the spring, it was now 1915, spring of 1915, he decided that he had taken over that collective 5 years such a psychic beating, always being the tail end of everything, disgraceful academic grades, that he was just going to go on back to Savannah and do what it appeared had been his destiny in the first place, and that was become a sharecrop farmer. And it was with that intent that he had about 1 week to go for the end of that semester before he would go back to sharecropping. Now, the reason this story is so particularly personal to me is because had my dad gone back to that sharecrop life, the odds are overwhelming that his children, whomever they might have been, would have grown up on one of those little postage stamp-sized sharecrop farms, and as they began to mature, would have begun to hear that siren song that would sweep the Black South, quote, go north and do good, which set into motion what later would become virtually a black migration off the southern sharecrop farms into the black districts in metropolitan cities in the Detroit, various other places, which was the seedbed of those communities which today we call the ghettos, with whose social problems we are laboriously trying to do something. But what happened was, during that final week there, before he was going back to the farm, Dad got an answer to a letter which he earlier had written, sort of in a wild hope, without any real thinking he would get an answer, and particularly an affirmative answer. But he did get one. He had written to the Pullman Company. Every summer during that time, the Pullman Company would elect 24 hand-picked young black college men to augment the regular Pullman Porter force to become a special extra force during peak travel summertime period. He had been selected as one of them. He was absolutely jubilant. One morning, now summer 1915, he was on a train running from Buffalo to Pittsburgh. He said it was around 2 in the morning when his buzzer rang, and he sprang up in haste, put on his white jacket, and hurried to the indicated compartment. There he found a man and his wife along in years who could not sleep and who each wanted a glass of warm milk. They had hastened and got the milk, brought it to them, and was to leave, and when the man who was standing now in the aisle in slippers and a robe seemed to want to talk, and of course Dad couldn't leave. And in the course of the man's questions, he got very interested upon learning that Dad had come from college to that job. And Dad, of course, did not tell him that he was going back to the sharecrop farm. The following day, when they got to Pittsburgh, in a time when 50 cents was a good tip for that trip, the man gave Dad an epical $5. Dad was profusely thankful. He saved every cent he got his hand on all that summer. At the end of the summer, he was counting up his money, and he had a total which he first saw as that with that amount of money, he could, on return to Savannah, buy his own mule and his own plow, which would put him kind of ahead in the sharecropping business. But then he looked at that money in another light. Now, the strongest expression of its kind I ever heard my father make was dadgummit. When he said that, you move. Dad said he got to thinking about it, that also that same amount of money would pay his way one full semester of school. And that dadgummit, he felt he had earned the right to go and study without having to work at all, at least one semester. Then he'd go back to the farm, at least content with the knowledge within himself of what he might have done had he been able to go to school without such a back-breaking work commitment. Thus intended, he went back to Greensboro. When he got there, the president of the college sent for him and showed him correspondence that a man, naturally that man on that train, had written to the president asking what was the price of a full year's everything. The president had answered, I believe it was $518, books, board, tuition, food, room, everything at that time. The man had sent his personal check. And that was how it happened that my father was able then to go to school without working at all. That year, 1915 into 1916, he made an A- average. Then I like to think that God does these kinds of things. That was the year, 1916, when Cornell University School of Agriculture initiated a program under which they volunteered to each of the then 17 Negro land-grant colleges a scholarship for graduate study in agriculture to the top agricultural student at each of those 17 colleges. That was how it happened that my father won it. That was how, when he married my mother, who was Bertha George Palmer, who had been born and reared in Henning, Tennessee, and they had met in Jackson at Lane College, both of them singing in the choir, a Tennessee story. They married, they went together to Ithaca, New York, where he studied toward his master's at Cornell University, and my mother from Henning studied music at the Ithaca Conservatory. And that was how it happened, that it happened born in Ithaca, and they very speedily, as soon as I could travel, like 2 months later, had me back in Tennessee, where I was to spend the rest of the time. And then that's how there were ultimately 2 other brothers of us born who were their children. Now the point to me is, and a deeply subjective point it is, that instead of growing up on one of those little sharecrop farms with the almost inevitable ghetto-bound legacy of that, we children had the blessing, no less than that, to grow up in Tennessee as the children of educated parents. A home full of books, a home full of parental concern, observation, guidance, direction, inspiration, and a home in which there was faith, in which there was prayer before every meal, and all the things that all of us of whatever race tend to get in small southern towns, which have the added bonus of educated parents. And that's how it has happened, very directly, that the three sons of us, instead of being today somewhere in some ghetto, being possibly some problem to society, have had the fortune instead to be contributory to society. Again, I stress products of Tennessee,